you, for anybody new, this gentleman is Mr. Andrew Collins. He has been doing incredible research for many years. He's made a name for himself as, shall we say, an archaeologist. I don't know how you want to call it, astro-archaeologist, but this man actually has a cave named after him underneath the pyramids. That impressed me, so there we go. And yes, exactly, yes. And you've only got, when you go out later on, some of Andrew's books are on the desk and he'll be signing some. And you'll see the huge array of subjects that he's been researching over the years. And tonight, we're going to hear about Stonehenge and a few other things. And it might tap in rather well with the talk we had earlier on about universal geometry, because we're going to be hearing about, Stonehenge as a universe in its own right. So listen, I'm going to shut up. Please, a massive hand for Mr. Andrew Collins.
Hello. Right. We'll forget the formal introductions because I think we're running late. So let's get on with the business, I think. Stonehenge. Right, you can all hear me okay? Yeah? Right. This is Stonehenge. And all sorts of theories have been put forward as to what its purpose was, what it might have functioned at. These include, was it a place where druids worshipped the sun? Is it a place where we venerate the ancestors, the dead? Or is it a cattle corral where you herd in the cattle and then slaughter them? Because, obviously the circles of stone would keep them in there. Honestly, that's a real theory. Is it a healing sanctuary like Lourdes in France? This was proposed just in time for the 2012 Olympics in London, just so all of the dignitaries could go there and not be told that it was a place of the dead, basically. Or is it something else altogether? And it's that something else that we'll be talking about tonight, because what we're going to be looking at is whether it functioned as a sonic temple. And if it did function as a sonic temple, why? And the idea that there was some kind of relationship between Stonehenge and sound goes back an awful long way. The earliest name for Stonehenge is the choir gore, which means the great choir, which is also interpreted as the giant's dance. And both of these suggest the use or the presence of sound. And obviously this is an image here of Stonehenge from medieval times, connected with Merlin. And Thomas Hardy, the famous English writer, author of Tessa d'Urberville's, he lived near Stonehenge, visited it on a regular basis, and talked about the strange hum that comes out of Stonehenge, particularly at night. He said it sounded like a harp with one string. And in 1899, he actually said of it, he says, if a gale of wind is blowing, the strange musical hum emitted by Stonehenge can never be forgotten. And over the years, there have been a series of studies done at Stonehenge, concluding that the generation of sound was very important there. One of these was by Dr. Rupert Till, Professor of Music, Department of Music and Drama at University of Huddersfield. And basically what he concluded was that the different components, which we'll talk about as we go along, would not just hold in the sound, but would cause sound that was generated in the middle of the monument to reverberate and echo around at different frequencies. And he also worked out that the prime frequency of Stonehenge, based on the monuments that are still there today, the different components, was in the range of 10 hertz. And 10 hertz we'll come on to is in the infrared range, but we'll talk about that separately. But basically he said that these low frequency resonances could be produced by strong winds. Again, a really important point. There was a hierarchy of position in the space of Stonehenge, implying that the different circles around the centre, such as the large bank and various stone circles, demarcated different levels of significance, with the centre the most important position. Again, very important. Artist and archaeologist Aaron Watson and acoustician David Keating, they came to similar conclusions as Till. basically saying that the central area was the most important place and that sounds would reverberate around and be contained within the actual structure. And then we come on to one which has only recently been in the news again, although work's been going on this since 2019 as far as I'm aware. And this is the work of Professor Trevor Cox of the University of Salford with the author, that's me, in 2020. Basically what he did was to create a 1/12 size Stonehenge inside an acoustic chamber and release sounds at different places within it and obviously record them and look at the different frequencies. And basically what he discovered, again, very similar to what these other guys had themselves found, is that sound generated within the enclosure was only for those inside. In other words, if there were people outside, they would hardly hear anything, just muffled noises. So any sound was purposely done to almost be reflected inwards into the interior. Again, we have to start asking, why was this done? But arguably, the most enlightening study that was done was by Earth Mysteries researcher Paul Devereux and John Wollstonecraft at Stonehenge as part of the Landscape and Perception project sponsored by the Royal College of Art in London. And basically, they looked at the blue stones. There are two main stones at Stonehenge. One are the so-called sarsens. The sarsens are the trilithons, the huge, great signature uprights and lintels that you see there. But the smaller pillars are made of something which is generally referred to as bluestone, and it comes from West Wales, the Preseli Hills, which you can see here. One of the main sites is a place called Carnmenin. And the bluestones from there are made of spotted dolerite. That's the geological name. And what they found was that these stones ring when you tap them or knock them in some way. And that they, in other words, they're what archaeologists refer to as lithophones. And that various ancient cultures used these to produce sound. And what's interesting is that very close to the Preseli Hills is a village called Meon Clochog, and please excuse my Welsh pronunciation here. And there is a legend, a story about two standing stones, possibly part of a much bigger structure, megalithic structure there, that would, on their own, generate a supernatural sound that would resonate outwards. And it was said that until somebody went to a local holy well and took water and brought it to the church, presumably to be used as holy water, these megaliths would not stop their singing. And unfortunately, I think in the 18th century, some men broke up this megalithic monument trying to understand why it created this sound, and thereafter they were silent. And basically what Devereux and Wollstonecraft concluded was that these stones, these blue stones from the Preseli Mountains, had initially been used within a stone circle there, a place called Main Warren. And the reason why they were used was to create a soundscape. In other words, to enliven, enrich the local landscape with sound. And that the reason why they were brought to Salisbury Plain, a minimum distance of around 135 miles, certainly overland, some people believe obviously that they went by sea, and around the coast and up the River Avon eventually, reaching Stonehenge, that was to try and recreate that same soundscape on Salisbury Plain, so they created Stonehenge. In other words, they were moving the stones to recreate this soundscape from one place to the other. And this idea of using these stones to create rock bells is something that's very real. And I think there's got a lot to do with legends to do with supernatural bells that ring of their own accord. I mean, here's just a stone bell from a Hindu temple, a place called Hosola in India. And quite clearly, it rings as good as any metal bell. So the idea of using stones to produce sound is incredibly important. And that is the reason why the bluestones were brought to Stonehenge. Here's a couple that have been, highlighted here. And they're the much smaller pillars. But what's also interesting is that although we see the huge trilithons, there was at least 2 bluestone trilithons that were much smaller that Stonehenge expert Simon Banton believes actually were used to produce sound by banging them, possibly the uprights or even the lintels, and that this was almost used as a musical instrument in its own right. So why was sound important at Stonehenge? Well, there are clues from other nearby monuments. One of these is Durrington Walls. This is a Neolithic encampment about 2 miles away from Stonehenge. And this was constructed around the same time as Stonehenge, between about 3000 and 2500 BC. And what we know about Durrington Walls is that it was a place of gathering of peoples coming from all over the country, bringing their livestock with them, and feasting around the time of midwinter. And we know that because the bones are fattened, and it shows that the animals were ready for slaughter and ready to be eaten. And what Mike Parker Pearson, the archaeologist that's done so much work on Stonehenge, believes is that people would gather at Durrington Walls. They would then walk along the nearby River Avon and pick up the Stonehenge Avenue, which is like this twin avenue bank that takes you all the way to Stonehenge, probably to watch either sunset on the winter solstice, and or watch sunrise at the time of the winter solstice, in other words, the following morning. So there's a relationship between the 2 sites. But what's so interesting is that in 2020, it was announced that 20 massive stone shafts or pits cut into the chalk bedrock had been found in a rough circle around Durrington Walls, making one of the largest, if not the largest, prehistoric monument in Britain. Now, these shafts are about 10 metres across by 5 metres deep. And this is what they looked like in the past. I mean, this is what they look like now. That's myself and my good friend Hugh Newman here at the site of one of them in a field not far from Durrington. And we did some experiments there to try and see if it was still hollow by me bashing a baseball bat on the ground. But all that ended was me breaking the baseball bat, but it's never mind. The video's there somewhere out there. But this is what it looked like in the past. Now, of these 20, they reckon that there was possibly as many as 50 of them originally, and this is what they look like. And the question becomes, what were they used for? Well, my colleague, the engineer Rodney Hale, who's still alive, still working, going strong, he was a person that suggested that they could be sound resonators, and that there may have been a roof on them or a partial roof, and that wind would have whipped around inside them, causing extreme low-frequency activity. And you could also have used instruments within them, but I think that wind would have been really, really significant. And he was able to work out that the resonant frequency of an average size shaft at Durrington was in the range of 15.71 hertz. And the thing about this is that it's in the infrasound range, which is below 20 hertz, down to 0 essentially, but we'll say 1. And the thing about infrasound is you can't really hear it, but you can feel it inside. And not only does it cause a certain amount of anxiety, it can cause fear, but it can also cause otherworldly experiences. It's actually used by skeptics of the paranormal to explain the appearance of ghosts and other paranormal or haunting-like phenomena. In other words, if they go into a haunted house and find the source of infrasound, they say, that's to blame, that's what's affecting people's heads, and it's causing them to see what they believe are ghosts. But in my opinion, this is throwing the baby out with the bathwater, in the sense that infrasound, yes, it triggers altered states of consciousness, including the seeing of, otherworldly beings, but also the appearance of portals or doorways into other worlds. And I cite here the work of Steve Marshall at West Kennet Longborough. He did a lot of good work on West Kennet being a sound resonator, and he worked out that not only was infrasound present, but when it was generated, it could cause people to have visions of doorways opening at the end of the chambers. Now, another monument in the area of Durrington, just to the south of it, is what's known as Woodhenge. And this is a series of 6 concentric post holes that used to have wooden posts in them. And this is essentially what it looked like in the past. Clearly the wood's rotted away, and today you just have concrete posts. But this is what it looked like in the past. These massive tall posts in 6 separate rings. And this is what it looks like today. I mean, you can go and visit it. It was investigated for the first time, I think, in 1926. And it was John Michel, the great visionary of the Earth Mysteries subject, that in his seminal work, The View Over Atlantis, which came out in 1969, he talked about Woodhenge being what he referred to as an Aeolian harp. Basically, what he proposed was that strung between each of the wooden posts were different chords of different thicknesses and at different lengths, and that these would generate sound that would have been so eerie, so bizarre, that it quite clearly would have become the central focus of the local community, for their rituals and ceremonies. And, low-frequency sound is used all over the world by different indigenous cultures to this day. And here's obviously a modern invention showing how the Aeolian harp works. But what he also said, in accompanying with these words, is that the ancient peoples that built the megalithic monuments, including Stonehenge and Woodhenge, understood what he referred to as a sonic pattern of the universe. And these are profound words, as we will see. But one thing that I noticed was that the maximum length of the posts of Woodhenge is 144 feet. Now, 144 feet is 144 is a very interesting cosmic number, but we don't know whether the ancients used imperial feet, so that could simply be a coincidence. But what I didn't find a coincidence is the fact that 7,244 feet, in other words, a unit of measure 144 feet, is the exact distance between the centre of Stonehenge and the centre of the Durrington shafts, as they are known, as you can see here. Plus, the distance across Durrington walls is 1,440 feet, ideally, which is 10 times 144 feet. And the distance between the post holes, the 56 post holes that once surrounded the stone monument at Stonehenge, known as the Albury Holes, because they were discovered in the 17th century by the antiquarian John Albury, who first described them. They are 288 feet in diameter, and that's 2 times 144 feet. So, this seemed to be beyond coincidence. Why was this amount coming up again and again? Well, I'll read you this out, and this is 144 feet as a wavelength. In other words, the distance that a wave rises up and comes back to the same position of sound is 7.815 hertz. And that, as I say, that's the distance of travel of sound vibration from high pressure to low pressure, back to high pressure again. The first higher harmonic of 7.815 hertz is 15.63 hertz, and that's close to the resonant frequency of the Durrington shafts at 15.71 hertz. Now, you don't have to take all this in at the moment, but, I wrote all this up in a paper that was published on ancient origins in 2020 as, a novelty more than anything else. But now it's no novelty in this, what we found out in the past few months. So why might a sound frequency of 7.815 hertz have been recorded in the Stonehenge landscape? It's almost as if the people that constructed these monuments were aware that this distance was important to create a particular frequency of sound or to preserve its existence. So to try and understand why this would have been important, we have to look at Stonehenge itself and the construction and who built it. And it was built in three main phases, which you can see here, starting at the top with the henge, which is a ditch and bank, with the 56 Aubrey holes in it, and the so-called station stone rectangle, which we'll come on to. Then there was a horseshoe of bluestones in the centre placed, and then eventually the Sarsen trilithons were placed in position in the third phase. And all this happened roughly between 3000 and 2400 BC. And after this, a people known as the Beaker people, the Beaker culture, came over from Europe. They brought the Bronze Age into Britain, and things changed, but they continued to honour Stonehenge through until certainly around 1600 BC. There was activity there, and of course, clearly, it was still revered right the way through to Roman times and beyond that into post-Roman times and the Saxon period as well, where it started to go into decline. Now, these are the different phases. We'll come back to some of the individual ones. But one of the most important features at Stonehenge is what's known as the station stone rectangle. This is a 5:12 ratio rectangle that marks 4 megaliths that come out at the same distance as the 56 Aubrey holes. And in one direction, they mark the most northerly and most southerly risings and settings of the moon, and exactly at right angles, perpendicular to that, they mark the rising of the sun at the time of the solstices, the very famous actual alignment at Stonehenge, and sunset at the time of the winter solstice. And these events of the sun and the moon happen perfectly at right angles to each other. This only happens at the latitude of Stonehenge. Go half a degree further north or further south and it won't happen. And that almost certainly is one of the reasons why Stonehenge was built where it is, for this specific reason. Now, this must have been very, very important to the builders. And of course, eventually, it's only the summer solstice sunrise that becomes important, and every feature that's built in the latter phases is pointed towards that. But it's very clear that probably in the much earlier stages, it was the sunset at the time of the winter solstice that was important, and probably the rising of the sun the following morning, again at the time of the winter solstice. So, you know, things develop there. But there is one feature which ultimately is the most important feature of the whole of Stonehenge, and it's often overlooked. And this is something called the altar stone. Now, this is a massive slab of sandstone that's full of mica, which is a very thin, sparkly mineral that makes it shine almost like a doorway full of stars. It's 16 feet long, by 4 feet wide, by 20 inches deep. It's a slab of stone, and it was long thought to have come from South Wales, not far from the bluestones. But a recent study on the mineralogy and the chemistry of it has shown that it doesn't come from Wales. It almost certainly comes from the Orkney Isles of Scotland. And this is incredible news. Not simply from the fact that this means that this 6-ton slab was transported by boat from the Orkney Islands across very rough seas to reach mainland Scotland, and then carted over land a minimum distance of about 530 miles to be placed in Salisbury Plain. Now, today it's on the ground, perfectly aligned to the sunrise at the time of the winter solstice and the sunset at the time of the summer solstice. That's deliberate. There's no question about that whatsoever. But it looks like before that, and I think it was laid down at a very early date, possibly during the early Bronze Age, but during the Neolithic Age, sometime between 3000 and 2500 BC, when it was first erected, it was standing. And it stood in the very centre of that station stone rectangle, and it looked something like this, basically. And this was the centre of it all. This was around everything else. All of the different features were like turning like cogs, directed to different solar or lunar events. This was the most important point. And as I said, somebody came along and then they turned it down. Why do we know that it was possibly erect? Because it's almost identical to other stones, slabs particularly, on the Isle of Orkney, particularly the Orkney mainland. Like this stone here, for instance, which is the Watchstone, which is right near the stone circles of Stennes, the stones of Stennes, and the Ring of Brodgar. There's another one that was there until recently called the Odin Stone. So, who was responsible for all this? And it's a culture that we know today as the Grooveware people. And the Grooveware people develop in the Orkney Islands in the last half of the 4th millennium BC, but their roots go back to the Mesolithic age of peoples almost certainly inbound from Northern Europe, places like Finland, Estonia, Lithuania. And they end up in the Orkney Islands, and eventually they flower into this beautiful Neolithic culture called the Grooveware people. And as the name suggests, they are well known for the type of ceramics that they created, which have flat bottoms, but are beautifully decorated with lozenges and diamonds and herringbone designs and whatever. So it's very, very distinctive. And we know that these people were at Stonehenge because examples of grooveware have been found at the very base of the ditch around Stonehenge. And the ditch was the first thing that was constructed there. So we know that they were responsible for this. But they originally come from the Orkney Islands, exactly where the altar stone comes from. I mean, this, for instance, is the oldest stone circle in Britain, or certainly, the one on land, there's some in the water, that dates around 3000 BC. And nearby is the Ring of Brodgar, this massive, massive stone circle, very much like what you see at Avebury. And this was also created by the Grooveware people. And around 3000 BC, they uprooted and spread into Britain and Ireland, creating some of the most iconic monuments, or certainly influencing the development of Avebury, Silbury Hill, the Boyne Valley, Newgrange, in the East Riding of Yorkshire, where the tallest megalithic monolith in Britain is, the Rudstone, in Anglesey, where you have the passage grave of Bryn Cethli Du, and various other places around the country. Here's a map showing roughly some of the places that they end up, and for some strange reason, Clacton in Essex, and I've still not worked out what the hell that they were doing there yet, but we'll get to that one day. And they built Stonehenge, and this was absolutely confirmed by the work of William Hawley between 1990 and 1926, doing excavations on the site. And it was the well-known British archaeologist Stuart Piggott that formally identified the ceramic ware found there in 1936 as grooveware. He even termed that name, grooveware. So that's all very important. Plus, they were at Woodhenge and Durrington Walls. In fact, some of the ceramics found at Durrington Walls match exactly that found in excavations at a place called the Ness of Brodgar on the Orkney mainland. Now, the other interesting thing, and I'm not going heavily into this, but something that you as an audience, I know will accept this, is that almost all of the sites that the Grooveware people are responsible for responsible for building ritual complexes are all associated with UFOs and strange light phenomena, all of them. Whether it be the East Riding of Yorkshire, places like Bempton, whether it be the Boyne Valley, that's well known for UFO phenomena, the Isle of Anglesey. We obviously know that many lights are seen in the area of Stonehenge, and of course Avebury. Avebury, somewhere that's become the focus of crop circles in the last 30-odd to 40 years. And we know that a large number of mysterious lights have been seen there, right the way up to missing time experiences, close encounters, and other strange phenomena occurring there. And you have to ask yourself, is it possible that the Grooveware people sited their ritual complexes where strange lights were seen? In other words, they knew that these were places of ancient power. And I think that the answer is almost certainly yes. But as I said, this is a whole lecture in itself. So what was going on at Stonehenge back in the day, 3000 to 2500 BC? And for this, we've got to look at Stonehenge's underlying geometry, because some very interesting things emerge. All of the main components, from what I have discovered, conform to a unit of measure. We've obviously got the 144 feet, but a much smaller unit of measure of 9 feet. Now, this, again, it has to be emphasised that they didn't necessarily know about the imperial foot of 12 inches. That may just be coincidence that it's 9, but a unit of measure equaling 9 feet seems to have been used in the construction of it. You can see all the different things here. The trilithon, horseshoe, 45 feet. Sarsen circle, 108 feet, which is 9 times 12. The Albury holes, 288 feet, 9 times 32. The henge, 360 feet, 9 times 40. And, I mean, when I realised this, I thought, well, is there an ancient measure of 9 feet? Well, there is. And it's in Welsh tradition. 9 imperial feet equals 1 lateral yoke. I'm not going to try and pronounce the Welsh on this occasion. Part of something called the Venodotian Code, which was codified as early as the 5th century BC by a legendary ruler of the Welsh kingdom of Gwynedd named Dyfwyl Molmud. Again, I apologise to my Welsh compatriots. Remember also we have a measure of 144 feet, which is 9 times 16, or 8 times 12. Oh, sorry. And what's interesting is that if the altar stone was in the centre, if it was exactly 16 feet tall and half of it was buried, that would mean that 8 feet was above ground and that it would encode perfectly into it this unit of measure of 9, from one corner at the base to the opposite corner at the top. There would be 8 and 9 together, the vertical being 8 and the cross hypotenuse being 9, with approximately 4 across, it's just over, being the actual width. So again, I mean, I find that interesting. It's almost like they erected this altar stone to conform exactly to the unit of measure to be used in the construction of Stonehenge. Now, let's have a little detour for a moment, because in the advertising bill for my lecture, it mentioned Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe as well. So let's look at context of Stonehenge just for a moment. It is 7,000 years younger than Gobekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey that was constructed around 9,600 BC. There's an incredible series of stone structures with beautiful carvings of animals. The stones themselves are anthropomorphic. They're aligned towards the stars. Incredible engineering, technology, carving skills, and alignments towards the stars as early as 9,600 BC. And the sister site of Gobekli Tepe is Karahan Tepe, which you can see 2 pictures of here, including this incredible structure carved out of the bedrock with 11 pillars sticking upwards and this strange serpent-like 12th stone and this head sticking out of the side, which is this huge human giant head, basically. Now, this has generally been dated about 9,400 BC. So the question is, and a lot of people ask me this, what is the relationship between the megalithic culture of Britain, those that built Stonehenge and Avebury, and Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe? Well, the answer is there's no direct link. The people that built Stonehenge, as I mentioned earlier, almost certainly came through northern Europe, having passed on the northern side of the Ural Mountains that form the boundary between Europe and Asia. Whereas the people of Stonehenge and Karahan Tepe, they went around the southern edge of the Ural Mountains, either on the top or below the Caspian Sea, and end up in Anatolia. So there's a common origin, and that common origin is in Siberia. Why Siberia? Because recently we've discovered evidence of a human cousin called the Denisovans, after their main type site, which is the Denisova Cave, which is basically on the border between Kazakhstan, China, Mongolia, and Russia. And these people were incredibly advanced, right the way down till they disappear about 40 to 50,000 years ago, when our ancestors meet them for the first time, creating things like this beautiful bracelet, as it's called, made of a beautiful green stone that looks like it's done on a lathe, and it was worn on an arm like this. But what's so interesting is that it's got a hole in it that has such a fast feed rate that it matches a modern day drill, and yet it's at least 45,000 years old. These Denisovans also created the earliest bone needles, so they had tailored clothing. It suggested even that they domesticated and rode horses, which is something that we generally only associate with the beginning of the Bronze Age. They also created the earliest established musical instrument in a flute or whistle that was found in pieces inside the Denisova cave. By the way, they were also on the Tibetan Plateau in China, and probably as far east as Taiwan. And there was another branch of them in southeastern Asia and in Ireland, Southeast Asia as well. But it's the ones in Siberia that really seem to have been technologically advanced. And one of the reasons for going on to this excursion is the discovery of a cave lion figurine made of mammoth tusk. And here it is. I mean, some people have suggested it could be a comfort toy for a child. But what I find interesting about it is the amount of notches in it. You can see these little notches that are down. They have a very specific number. And here they are. They're all in groups of 4. And on one side you have 8 times 10, which is 40. Oh, sorry. I mean, you know, 4 times 10, which is 40. And then on the other side you have them in groups of 4 equaling 32. And this totals 72, which is a very important number. It's half 144, by the way. And 72 is 1/5 of a year if you class it as a 360-degree year with 5 extra days, which is what the ancient cultures believed. But in addition to this, 72 years is what it takes the stars to shift from the position of the horizon of the sun at the equinoxes by 1 degree. And this is exactly 72 years. It's also 9 Venus cycles of 8 years, exactly 72 years. So I don't think any of this is coincidence. And I think that the Denisovans, who I've written in various of my books, like The Cygnus Key, Denisovan Origins, passed on autistic genes to us that generate what we call, savant qualities, that they had these savant qualities. And one of them was their obsession with numbers generated through the movement of the sun and the moon in eclipse cycles. And it's not just me that's saying this. Books on autism talk about the way that the ancients must have used autism themselves. And I think this is the origin of this obsession with cycles of time. So as I said, obviously you can see where these people going on the northern route end up in the Orkney Islands. And this is where the grooveware culture does their thing. So you can read all about Karahan Tepe and its relationship to the Denisovans, and obviously Gobekli Tepe in my new book, Karahan Tepe, which is out in November. So watch out for that. And if you're interested in this type of stuff, myself, my colleagues, Hugh Newman, J.J. Ainsworth, put on a conference which will be in Pewsey on November the 2nd called Origins. There are flyers around for that, and we hopefully see you there. The other interesting last point is that the anatomical remains of the Denisovans found so far suggest that they were massive, and that they were probably equal to the biggest, WWE wrestlers or American footballers, and that they may well have been the giants of legend. And there are plenty of legends of giants not only in Britain, but obviously in the area of Siberia where the Denisovans were. And so this obsession with numbers, I think, comes from the fact that the grooveware people of the Orkney Islands have this obsession themselves with creating, measurements and distances and regulating time and the rest of it. And they bring this eventually to Stonehenge. So going back to what we said about the measurements being all equal to a unit of measure of 9 feet, something else comes out of this, that there are a whole number of ratios between the different features. I won't go over them all, but basically they're all whole number ratios of 5 or 10, suggesting that the underlying geometry of Stonehenge is either 5-fold or 10-fold based. And as we will see, it's 10-fold. And in particular, it's dodecahedral in nature. Now, a dodecahedron is a regular polyhedron with 12 sides, each of which have 5 sides of a pentagon, creating a 12-sided thing, and it's got 20 vertices or corners. But if you look at it as a skeletal form, and in a flat plan or two-dimensional form, it looks like this. And this is a geometric form in its own right. And it has, obviously, 10 points with the other 10 vertices on the interior part of it. And if you overlay this on Stonehenge, some very interesting things start to emerge. This is an old picture. You can see how the two-dimensional dodecahedron fits perfectly into framing the inner components of the monument. And here, if you put 2 dodecahedrons in, it makes even better sense. Remember, the underlying geometry is either 5-fold or 10-fold, so this makes perfect sense. Here it is again on a different version of the stones as they would have been seen complete. Obviously, we have to use things from the past because we don't know exactly what they are based on the measurements of today, but the ancients had a much better hanger on this because there were much more features still in place. And if you extend the points, or the faces, I should say, of a dodecahedron so that they come to a point, you create a 10-sided star, which is known as a small stellated dodecahedron. And that's what it looks like. And that's what it looks like as a sort of skeletal flat plan version. And once you start placing this over Stonehenge, once again, it starts constraining the inner components almost perfectly. Here you go again. But what's so significant about this, all this could be coincidence until you realize that the inner structure, you can see here, the inner structure of the small stellated dodecahedron perfectly frames the station stone rectangle. And remember, I've already said that this cannot be done any more than half a degree of latitude further north or further south of Stonehenge latitude, which, by the way, is 51 degrees plus. So, in other words, none of this geometry would work anywhere else. This dodecahedral form was specific to it and specific to the location, which I find quite incredible. And so going back to try and understand this, we find that the stones of Stonehenge use a unit of measure of 144 feet as well, showing that these ideas are definitely, in theory, coming down from the grooveware culture. And the reason why that's significant is one of the greatest enigmas of the Neolithic age for prehistorians and archaeologists is the carved stone balls, known as petrospheres. Now, these are handheld, so tennis ball size, or maybe slightly larger, some of them, balls that have these knobs on it, or geometric forms, and the knobs can be any more, can be 6, or they can be 160. And they're mostly found in the northern parts of Britain, mostly in Scotland, in the Orkney Islands, and it's accepted that this is where they were manufactured during the late Neolithic period. And amongst them are the 5 regular polyhedra that are described by Plato, including the dodecahedron. This was first written about and brought out by the Earth Mysteries researcher Keith Critchlow in his book Time Stands Still, which is an extraordinary book that's a forerunner of all the work that we're doing today. So is it possible that what we have at Stonehenge is almost like a landscape version of one of these stone balls, which, by the way, their use was almost certainly as points of contact with otherworldly realms. They were used to get into altered states of consciousness. And I think that they saw geometrical forms whilst in altered states and then brought them back to the land of the living and carved the stone balls to represent the place that they go. In other words, they replaced anthropomorphic idols of gods and goddesses and whatever. You know, to them, their symbol of intelligence and consciousness was these stone balls. So was it possible that Stonehenge is almost like a landscape form of one of these stone balls, built by the same people? Let's point this out. So what's so important about the dodecahedron and dodecahedral structure? Well, for this we have to go back to the ancient Greeks, because Plato, the great philosopher, in his book the Timaeus, written about 360 BC, stated in connection with the 5 regular polyhedron, well surely the 5th one I should say, that one construction still remained, the 5th, and God used this in order to embroider shapes upon the universe. In other words, what he's saying, and this is stressed elsewhere, is that the 12 signs of the zodiac, which are obviously strewn along the path of the sun on its annual course, their influence upon us is because of the dodecahedral structure of the universe as a whole. And he wasn't the first person to come up with these ideas. They almost certainly, well, I know, I'm sure, that he inherited them from earlier Pythagoreans. In particular, one guy called Philolaus, another philosopher, lived in the 5th century BC. He was the first person to associate the dodecahedron with the universe. And he said that the dodecahedron was an expression of quintessence, the 5th essence, the 5th element of nature, as well as the ether that forms the fabric of the universe itself. And what I find interesting is that if this is the case, and we'll have more evidence of this, I promise you, is that right from the macrocosm of the universe itself, right the way down to an atom, has dodecahedral structure. Because a Dutch physicist by the name of Jan van den Broek, again, I apologise to any Dutch here, in a book called The Dutch Paradigm, talks about electrons gathering themselves into a form of a dodecahedron, and this could be their most basic structure that they form. So in other words, from macrocosm to microcosm. I just wanted to throw that in. And so important was the dodecahedron to the Pythagoreans that a Greek philosopher, an early follower of Pythagoras, by the name of Hippasus, was not only expelled from the school for revealing the importance of the dodecahedron to the outside world, but according to one story, he was actually drowned on a fishing trip for doing so. Serious. Look it up. So, in other words, that's how much the Pythagoreans wanted to keep secret the importance of the dodecahedron. And also, here's something interesting, and my colleague J.J. Ainsworth has been studying these as well, which was one of the reasons I got onto this. And that is that over 130 bronze dodecahedrons have been discovered in Northern Europe. They date to the Roman period, but they're not Roman. None have been found in Rome at all, so it's clearly not part of the regular Roman life. And they're hollow, they each have holes, and many of them have radiating lines coming out of the holes from each of the 12 faces. And it's been suggested that maybe they were slingshot, or for making spaghetti, or for knitting aids for gloves, but I don't think it's any of that. Once again, they are like the carved stone balls of the Neolithic people, used as points of contact with other worlds, and one must presume dodecahedral structure. The latest one was discovered just last year at a place called Norton Disney, beautiful name, in Lincolnshire. And you can see these rings around the circles. And I think these rings are examples of sound emanating from them. You know, they are resonance. They're about sound and resonance. And we know that they're also connected with the 12 signs of the zodiac, because solid dodecahedrons have been found. This example from 1982 has each of the 12 signs of the zodiac on the faces. But all this is in the past. What about the present? Well, in 1904, a famous French physical theorist by the name of Jules-Henri Poincaré basically came up with the idea that the universe had to be dodecahedral in shape. This became part of something called the Poincaré conjecture, which has since been established. And basically we would find that the universe was not flat and infinite, but was actually closed, curved, and dodecahedral in structure. And his vision of the universe was dramatically confirmed in the 2000s through the mapping of something known as the cosmic microwave background. And this is the fact that in the first 380,000 years of the universe, it was full of something called plasma. Plasma is the full state of matter. In fact, the actual type of plasma is called the quark-gluon plasma. And when this cooled down, it started to form atomic matter, which fills the universe today. The residue of this plasma is still out there today. You can still measure it, because it's so far away that it's taking so long for the light and the electromagnetic radiation to reach us. So we can still send satellites up there. And one called the WMAP space satellite mapped this in the 2000s. And what they thought they would find was that the standard cosmological model would be confirmed, and that is the fact that our universe is flat as a pancake, and just infinite in every direction. In other words, the heat, the temperature of the cosmic microwave background should be constant all the way around. What they found is that was just not what happened, and that there were inconsistencies all over the place, and that they conformed, or certainly looked like they could conform, to dodecahedral structure, which means that Poincaré was almost certainly correct, and that the ancient Pythagoreans and Plato were also correct, that we live in a dodecahedral universe. And you try getting out of it, because apparently, even though that we exist in a three-dimensional existence, the actual border of our universe is four-dimensional. And that brings us into a whole different things that will blow your mind, which I'm not even going to go into today. But let's just say, in theory, you can't even leave the universe. If you try and leave it, you'll come back in the equal and opposite phase, but that's for another day. But what is also interesting is that within the cosmic microwave background, they've also found series of concentric rings, again, based on the temperature. And these were brought out in a paper by the famous British physicist Roger Penrose and Vahi Ghazadeh, his colleague, in a paper. And as soon as I saw this, I thought, these look exactly like Stonehenge. And what happens if I put a dodecahedron in two-dimensional form? And as you can see on the right, it fits absolutely perfectly. And if this is not a coincidence, then this is more evidence that outside or beyond or at the edge of our universe is dodecahedral structure. Okay? And here obviously is one of these pairs of concentric rings, and this is Stonehenge. It's identical. Is it possible that the builders of Stonehenge were intuitively aware of the structure of the universe? Is that why they created things like these carved stone balls, which included the dodecahedron, as you can see here? Is this the reason why Pythagoras, Philolaus, and Plato were so convinced that the universe was dodecahedral? And this brings us on to something else of significance, and that's the fact that Philolaus, but clearly Pythagoras before him, started to realize that the universe emits a sound. And that sound, although it's in theory inaudible to the human ear, can be recreated by an understanding of mathematics, geometry, and what's known as musical intervals and limits of tuning. And that therefore an instrument, if tuned properly, can replicate the sound of the universe itself. Now, Plato talks about this, and Philolaus calls it the divine harmonia. Plato referred to it essentially as the musica universalis, the music of the spheres. And that's the fact that the movement of the celestial bodies, the stars, the planets, the sun, the moon, all help to create this sound because they are all part of creation. They're all moving because of a creation that continues to go on to this day, and that this can be recreated. And this is something that Renaissance writers like and astronomers like Johann Kepler, Robert Flood, the Rosicrucian, and Freethinker, British guy, in the 17th century, and bringing it right up to date to the 20th century with Buckminster Fuller, who looked a lot of these ideas. That there's a relationship between music, geometry, mathematics, and the universe as a whole. And as I said, the term that you'll generally find association with it is the music of the spheres. But it's also been accepted that the Big Bang itself, that created that plasma in the first 380,000 years, produced a sound, or actually was accompanied by what you might call a primordial sound of creation. And John Cramer, a famous physicist and science writer, used the different frequencies. This is what he actually says. Mr. Cramer took the measurement data of the cosmic microwave background from the ESA Planck Space Telescope and converted the energy frequencies into audible sound. He multiplied it by 10 to the power of 26 so we could hear it. And I haven't got it. This is on YouTube if you want to hear it. And it's not that particularly exciting, in all honesty. But it's there, and the concept, I think, is incredibly important, because what it suggests is that the ancients were aware not just of the dodecahedral structure of the universe, but that it produced a primordial sound. So we have to go back to what John Michel told us in The View Over Atlantis as far back as 1969, that the megalithic people were aware of a sonic pattern of the universe. And remember, this was long before the cosmic microwave background was discovered in the 2000s. And the work of Paul Devereux and John Wollstonecraft in connection with the bluestones at Stonehenge and at their point of source at the Preseli Hills. He referred to the use of these bluestones as creating what they referred to in their paper as dormant sound. And this is an incredibly important statement because, as they themselves point out, that this was a term coined by the cosmologists investigating the sound frequencies unleashed by the Big Bang. In other words, exactly what we're talking about, the cosmic microwave background creating the divine harmonia. And what they are saying is that the builders of Stonehenge were aware of this. And this is incredible because we're getting very close to some big discovery here. Because what's the frequency at the core of cosmic creation? Is it possible that we can actually find out what that frequency was? I mean, not just, use a few sounds to recreate it from electromagnetic frequencies, but is there an actual sound, an actual frequency? Now, Rupert Till, in his work at Stonehenge, saw a resonant frequency of 10 hertz. The units of measure of 144 feet at Stonehenge and in the surrounding landscape gives us a frequency of 7.15 hertz. So very, very close, but are either of them correct? And it was at this point that I started to look online for inspiration, and I came across a post that was done a few years ago by my colleague J.J. Ainsworth, linking the dodecahedrons, the Roman dodecahedrons, which we'd shown, with the use of cymatics. Cymatics, if you don't already know, is the generation or the manifestation of sound through amplification and the use of some kind of solid, liquid medium. Most obviously water, but you can use iron filings, you could use powder of some kind. And I therefore wondered whether a particular frequency was associated with creating a dodecahedron. This is an example of a dodecahedron created through cymatics and with the geometry of Stonehenge overlaid, or the dodecahedral geometry as a whole. Well, this led me to somebody who I knew and who's given talks at our conferences in the past, the Questing Conference in particular I used to run, by the name of John Stuart Reid. Now, he is an expert in cymatics. He's done work inside the Great Pyramid, recreating the resonant frequencies there, for instance. And he said to me, you need to check out the Merian matrix. I said, the what? The Merian matrix. I said, well, what's that? He said, well, a multidisciplinary team have been working on the idea that there is some kind of geostructure at the core of creation, extending on from the work of the Pythagoreans, Plato, Johannes Kepler, Buckminster Fuller, etc., etc. And they've devised this structure, which they call the Merian matrix. Now, this was first devised in 1999, and the team have been working and revising of this, and they've produced a very, very thick book called the Merian matrix that you can see here. And I've read it from cover to cover to try and fully understand what was going on here. And I'm so, so glad that I actually read this book, got the book, and read it because I fully understood what was going on. Because what they worked out is that there was a primal, or what they call a prime or priming frequency associated with this core of creation. And they predicted that this particular frequency would generate the Merian matrix, which has a dodecahedral structure. Okay? But not just any old dodecahedron, the dodecahedron in a four-dimensional form that has 120 dodecahedrons inside it. Okay? Now, they came to John Stuart Reid in, I think the date was 2012, and said, John, look, could you use this frequency with your equipment, which is known as the CymaScope? Right there. He is the CEO of a company called CymaScope. It's an instrument that will create into manifestation sound. So he said, yeah, we'll give it a go. So the team all assembled in the north of England at John's laboratory, and they used this particular frequency, 7.97, and it generated the Merriam matrix as the amplitude was increased, exactly as they had predicted. But even more interesting, I mean, this is one still from the film that they created, and look how similar it is to a four-dimensional dodecahedron. And remember, this is our view of a four-dimensional dodecahedron, but we don't know. We're not four-dimensional creatures. We're three-dimensional creatures, so we can only guess at what it looks like, okay? But here's the interesting thing. If you switched the CymaScope 1/100th of a frequency, away from 7.97, the whole thing collapsed and was not there. Either way. So in other words, it only was created at 7.97 hertz. But here's where it starts getting really interesting, because as the Merriam matrix came into existence, a ball of plasma appeared above the water, right in the center, as the whole structure was forming. Now remember, we're looking at it two-dimensional. Clearly, it's in a three-dimensional or possibly even a four-dimensional form all around you. We only see it in two-dimensional because we're using water surface. It's like us looking at our reflections in a puddle of water. You know, we're three dimensions, but when we're looking at a puddle of water, our mirror reflection is two-dimensional, of course. And here you have a ball of light appearing. And they were able to photograph it. This is not one of the photographs, but they appear in the book, and they also appear in the articles I've done on this subject that have been published this week. And here's the important thing. Plasma, as we've seen, is the very thing that comes into existence at the beginning of our universe for the first 380,000 years. It's the same stuff that comes out of the macrocosmic form of the dodecahedron. So, do I think that the Merriam matrix is at the core of creation? The answer is absolutely. This is the frequency, 7.97 hertz. And we already said this about the 1/100th of it. But here's the important thing. Merriam matrix, 7.97 hertz. The measurements at Stonehenge, 7.815. They came very close, I think, to replicating that primeval sound of creation at Stonehenge. They were, you know, look how close they were. And I think that this is quite extraordinary. And so, really, we're coming towards the close now. We have to ask ourselves what Stonehenge actually represents. Was it a place where the Druids worshipped the sun? Was it a place where we venerated the dead? A cattle kraal? A healing sanctuary? Or was it something else? And here's my summary of what I would say. Stonehenge's primary function was to replicate the primordial sound of creation through acting as a representation of the universe in its dodecahedral form. This was achieved by locking it into the cosmic mechanisms seen as responsible for cyclic time and thus the divine harmonia of Philalethes. Okay? So that's essentially it. But to finish my lecture, I have something special for you. It's a video of the Merriam matrix forming.
In December 2012, we reconvened in northern England, and the lab was set up to resonate a few drops of water to disprove that this inaudible priming frequency, less than 8 hertz in the theta range, actually generated a very complex pattern. The frequency was injected into the cell using a voice coil generator, and as the amplitude, or the volume, was slowly increased, a pattern of rings appeared, and to almost everyone's amazement, the predicted blue sphere appeared, opened, and evolved into a geometric and knotted pattern that is a precise match to the Marian matrix.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew Collins.
Let me just run through this if I can. But yes, absolutely. Right, just here's the commercial bit, if I may. My new book, Karahan, Tepe, Civilization of the Anunnaki and the Cosmic Origins of the Serpent of Eden, is out in November over here. So watch out for that. And here's something. I first appeared at this conference in the early 1990s after I wrote and published a book called The Circle Makers. And some of you may still have this on your bookshelf somewhere. And what was I saying at the time? That crop circles were ultrasonic orgone signatures, the product of plasma intelligences. And I still stick to that today as far as genuine crop circles are concerned. And so really what we're doing now is really an extension of all of that work to do with the appearance of crop circles at the beginning of the 1990s. Here's some of my other books. I'll be signing books outside if you're interested immediately after this lecture. These are from all different periods of my existence. And if you want to experience something more, why not come with us on these expeditions, these tours to Gobekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and many other sites that myself, Hugh, and JJ do as part of the Megalithomania team in May next year and in September this year. We've got flyers of that outside. And we're going to Egypt in November if you want to come along with us to all the obvious sites there. And that is it, andrewcollins.com if you want to contact me. But there is just one final thing I've got here, which we can play in the background as we begin to take a few questions. And I was only going to play this if we got time, but we have got time. And this is another interesting little story, a little anecdote, is a good friend of mine by the name of Annie Williams, who is a musician, composer, and a music therapist, as well as a writer of books on ancient mysteries. She took a harp into Stonehenge and held it up into the air and used it as an Aeolian harp and just walked around the stones, and her movements and the gentle winds that were passing through the stones created an incredible noise, a beautiful sound, and that when she came out, the security guard said to her, what's that incredible sound that you were making there? And she obviously told them. They said, we hear that sound at night coming from the stones, but only when it's dead still and sometimes when it's fog. So in other words, Stonehenge still operates as a sonic temple to this day. This is the sound that she created. Just to imagine this. That's the altar stone right at the centre of it. Just think of that as the being, the powerhouse of this site, controlling all of these cosmic mechanisms. See it as an entity in its own right. Who does it represent? Well, in the knowledge that the Grooveware people came down from the Orkney Islands of Scotland, and we know that their ancestors came from Northern Europe, the chances are that they spoke a Uralic language, part of the language group in that region, which has its own mythology. And it talks about a sky being that controls all the mechanism of the universe. And his name is Ilmar, or Ilmarin. You can find him in the Finnish epic, Karahan. And I think that this represents a form of Ilmar. And the reason why they brought it all the way from the Orkney Islands is because it was a living entity. It's a being in its own right, just like the standing stones at Gobekli Tepe. So, oh, sorry. That was so nice, and I just messed it up there. Anyway, I think that's enough. That's enough. But thank you. But have we got any time for questions, or is that it? A few minutes.
We've got a few minutes.
Okay. The hand goes up there. I've got my glasses on.
Please wait for the microphone, thank you.
Can I ask about the Schumann resonance of the Earth? Because that's 7.83. 83.
Yeah, but it does vary from about
very
frequency.
close to the
Okay, this is a big question. What is the relationship between these primal frequencies of creation and the Schumann resonance? Schumann resonance is created by lightning occurring all the time around the globe, and it bounces off, creating these electromagnetic frequencies that are constantly present, contained within the atmosphere of the Earth itself. And I got onto this, and I wrote it in an article in 2020 and said there must be a relationship between the two. And it was quickly pointed out to me that the 7.83 hertz of the Schumann resonance is an electromagnetic frequency, which is in theory a transverse wave, whereas sound is a vibration, which is a longitudinal wave. They are two completely separate things. So in theory, it's a mere coincidence. But I have talked about this to people, and they said there's an indirect link, because you can use electromagnetic frequencies to create sound, you can use sound to create electromagnetic frequencies. And the most obvious example of that, of course, is a crystal radio set. Obviously that, receives radio frequencies, and they can then be, reconstituted as sound. So, there is a relationship, but if it is only indirect. Anybody else?
Who do you want to go
Like it
for?
there?
Right.
Probably a very silly question. Why do I burst into tears when I get near Stonehenge?
Why do you burst into tears when you get near Stonehenge? That's a very interesting question, and I suppose only you can answer that. It doesn't do that for me. I mean, and what's so weird is that all of this stuff that you've heard today has only come together in the past 7 or 8 months. And I put this together. There is a 2-part article which is on academia.edu and on ResearchGate that I've done on this. Very sensible paper on all of what I've talked to you about today. But I think in answer to your question, I think it's because in the past Stonehenge represented the centre of Britain it was the pinnacle of achievement of our prehistoric ancestors. And quite clearly it holds so many secrets that, somehow intuitively we're aware of this. And even down to the age of King Arthur and Merlin, it was still a place where kings were crowned, kings were buried, the place of gathering of the Druids and all the rest of it. And quite clearly this is a leftover going back to prehistoric times. And I think that even though today you might say, well, there's modern Druids that only came into existence, the Druid order in the 18th century, what have they got to do with the Druids of the past? Well, the answer is that quite clearly the Druids are the descendants of the megalithic builders themselves. They haven't come from Phoenicia or, Canaan or something like that, as they used to believe in the 19th century. The latest evidence seems to suggest that they themselves are the descendants. They are the custodians. They were the guardians of the stone circles and prehistoric sites. So really, the modern day Druids are essentially just reviving, the own religion of the British people. This is our indigenous religion. This is one of the reasons why we are able to go to Stonehenge at the equinoxes and the solstices. Talking to Hugh only about this today. It's only because of those modern day Druids sitting at council board meetings of English heritage who don't want us to go into these sites at the solstices and the equinoxes, that they speak on behalf of the British Navy and say it's our right to be at these places, at the solstices and the equinoxes. Right.
Hold on, please wait for the microphone. Thank you.
This must be a healing sound. And
Sorry?
could you repeat? It's a healing sound, and for the earth, and for the humans.
Yes, yeah. Okay, I suppose that's an important question. Why do they want to generate this sound in the first place? And let's point out, there isn't just one frequency here. There are many different frequencies associated with Stonehenge, but they were trying to hit the prime frequency. And quite clearly, because it was in the infrasound range, you couldn't even hear it. You could probably feel it if it was created strong enough. And I think it was being created at various of the different monuments around the Stonehenge landscape, as it probably was at many other places in Britain, as we know it was in, let's say, Hindu temples in the Indian subcontinent. They tried to enhance the acoustics of the subterranean temples to reflect the primeval sounds, created originally by Vishnu when the universe was created. So this is not something that's unique to Stonehenge, but it's quite clear that there was a reason for them doing this. And I think that the key word is creation, because for them, creation wasn't something that happened at the time of the Big Bang. It's something that's going on all of the time. And that creation not only creates and allows the continuance of the world around them, but turns everything. It creates time. Time is the essential element here, because at the moment of creation, of first creation, time comes into existence. So that creation sustains time. So they've got to do it, because in their view, if they stop trying to resonate with the primordial sound of creation, the world could come to an end. The universe could collapse. They have to do their part. So what you were saying, quite clearly, these frequencies are incredibly important. And the one that you just heard that Annie Williams recorded, yes, it can obviously be used for healing purposes and clearly for meditation as well. I've used it already, to gain inspiration whilst doing this work that I presented you tonight.
One last question.
I think it's going to be that lady there, I'm afraid.
Thank you. It sounds as
it sounds as if a portal has been opened. Do you think that portal is for the use of balancing human brain waves?
Yeah, I mean, you heard the lady on there whose name is Lynn Claire Dennis, who's one of the main people behind the Merriam Matrix, talking about theta waves. And obviously theta waves are associated with entering into altered states of consciousness, particularly when you're starting to drift off. You know, that you go into a theta wave state, and it's at that moment that the connection with what you might call the divine actually occurs. It's not in deep sleep, you know, during REM sleep. It's during non-REM sleep when you're just drifting into or coming out of deep sleep. And so therefore, there is a relationship there, as she obviously quite clearly said. And that's something that I will be taking up with her, and something that we might better understand about how to bring all of this together. The use of the sound, the use of the geometry, and the use of the theta waves, you know, to try and absolute fine-tune how we ourselves, like the grooveware culture clearly did, using Stonehenge and, of course, those stone balls, you know, to connect with the divine, essentially.
Well, I think that is pretty mind-blowing. Ladies and gentlemen, please, Andrew Collins. Fantastic.